Well, we got the Louisiana Purchase done last time. We found out that Jefferson went ahead with it and sort of ignored the constitutional questions that he himself would have raised and objections to it, but he went ahead with it, and it was a good deal, and it worked out well. And so that took care of that, and we then had, and would never worry again about access to New Orleans. We've got both sides of the river all the way down, and so, and the city of New Orleans itself is in our possession, so everything's taken care of. Now, I don't know, it's kind of a long story that I love to tell about why Napoleon decided to sell Louisiana to the United States. Now, this is kind of a tricky thing. Remember, he had just acquired it less than a year earlier from Spain. He, as I told you, he just kind of threatened Spain with all sorts of bad stuff if they didn't give it to him. But he did work out an agreement with them. He had a treaty with them transferring the title from Spain back to France. And in that, he promised, absolutely promised, that he would never sell that land to the United States. Spain was very apprehensive about that. You know, Spain, I've talked about this a little bit before, they're a little suspicious of us. Spain doesn't entirely trust the United States because we're an Anglo nation Protestant and a strong anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. There's lots of people in this country who hated Catholics. And you know, going back to the Puritan days and back to a long time before, but some people never give up. And Spain knows about that, and they know that they're a Catholic nation, so they know that there's a lot of animosity to them. And they didn't entirely trust us, and they thought we were expansionists. We might try to take over other territory that they have, you know, all the way down into Mexico and out to the west coast, out to California and so forth. So they got a deal from Napoleon that he would promise not to sell that land to the United States because they don't want the United States to have that. Well, so he signs the treaty. 8 months later, he changes his mind and sells it to the United States. So much for promises and treaties and everything else like that. And it's a long story as to why he decided to do that. But to kind of get to the simplest part of the story, it's kind of a fun story to talk about, but I don't have time. The bottom line was he wanted money. And why did he want money? Well, he wanted money because he was going to go to war. Who was he going to go to war against? Oh, surprise, he's going to war against England. You know, France and England have had, over a couple of hundred years, they've had on-again, off-again wars for most of that time. You know, they fight this war, and then they have a peace, and they're at peace for a few years, and they fight another war. In our time that we've been talking about, they had the 7 Years' War, which went from 1756 to 1763. Then they had a peace, they had a treaty, and then of course during the Revolutionary War, France is our ally, went back to war against England again, and then that's ended with the Treaty of 1783. And then in the 1790s they had a war again. They were fighting a war again, and as I mentioned, you may not remember this, but they finally settled that in 1801, and that was what was important. I thought that the United States had entered into a time that Jefferson became president just when England and France had called off their latest war. Well, that time of peace lasted less than 2 years. Now here it is again, 1803. Napoleon wants to go to war again. And he sold Louisiana. Partly, it's a complicated story, but part of the deal was he just wanted money because he's going to start a war against England. Well, that puts the United States in a real bad spot because we really want to be able to trade without any restrictions. That's what we want to do with the rest of the world. We don't want to get involved in other world diplomatic or political or military alliances or complications. We want to remain neutral. We want to stay by ourselves. But trade, our economy is based on exporting our agricultural goods. We're a nation of small farmers, but farmers are in business to produce agricultural surpluses so that they can export it to other countries of the world that need our food. And we import nearly everything that we manufacture. So we we are heavily involved in international trade, and it's very important to us that we have access to that trade. And when France and England are at war, as they are now again, starting around 1803, when they're at war, they both recognize that the United States is a very valuable trading partner. We have a lot of resources. We're a big consumer of manufactured goods. Trade with the United States is very beneficial to everybody who does it. And that means that when England and France are at war, England wants to be able to stop trade between the United States and France. They're fighting a war against France. They recognize that trade with the United States is very beneficial to France, so they try to stop it. And the same is the other way around. France doesn't want us to trade with England because they realize that that trade is very beneficial to England. So they're both trying to stop us from trading with their respective enemy. To do that, Napoleon in 1806 issued, it's a little bit complicated, and just take it as it is. I'll send you these notes so you can get the terms. You get the terms in your notes. Napoleon issued what were called the Berlin and Milan decrees. Those were just some decrees that he issued when he was in residence in Berlin during the war. He's fighting all sorts of things. And he happened to be in Berlin, and he issued these decrees called the Berlin Decrees. And then he was in Milan, and he kind of issued some more that did sort of the same thing and built on it and everything else. And the basic principle of those was that he was declaring that France had a right to stop trade with England with whom they were fighting a war. That the French Navy could effectively prevent other nations from trading with England, their enemy. Well, this violates the American concept of neutrality. We argue from the standpoint of international law, which is very complicated on this subject, but we argue that as a neutral, we have a right to trade without being involved in the war. England and France, we argue, can have their war. Let them fight and kill each other and do whatever they want. Doesn't matter. All we want to do is be able to trade. And we want to be able to trade with everybody. And the Berlin and Milan decrees also applied to allies of England. England has allies on the mainland of Europe. They have their biggest ally, probably the best known, was Russia. And so the Berlin and Milan decrees cut off trade with England and all of its allies. And we said, we're neutral. We have a right to trade. That's what it means to be neutral. You're not involved in the war. You're not a party to the war, so they can't go after your ships. So we consider this totally illegal, a violation of international law. And then that same year, England issued what were called the Orders in Council. Orders in Council, which was just this English version of the same thing. England said that their navy had a right to stop trade between their enemy France and all of its allies, and a lot of Europe had been sort of taken over by Napoleon, so it was an ally to him by virtue of conquest. So the English Navy says we can't trade with France or any of its allies. France says we can't trade with England or any of its allies. That pretty much covered Europe. So, they're trying to stop our trade. And we argue both of those were illegal. We are a neutral. We have a right to trade with everybody, which is what we want. We just want to be able to trade and let other countries have treaties and alliances and intrigues and political deals and so forth. Just leave us out. Just let us trade as a neutral with everybody. All we care about is making money. Forget about everything else. So, this is a problem for Jefferson. How does he deal with both France and England violating American neutrality? He came up with an idea that he presented to Congress in December of 1807. So this is now near the end of 1807. His idea was called the Embargo Act. Congress passed the Embargo Act, which said that the United States would refuse to trade with both England, France, and all their allies, and incidentally with all other neutral nations, and even with ourselves, even our so-called coastal trade from one American port to another. What we're trying to do is cut off our trade as a way to pressure both England and France into accepting our version of international law, our interpretation that under international law, as a neutral, we have a right to trade with everybody. And we're hoping that, the plan is, that by putting this economic pressure on them, the embargo, cutting off trade, that they will relent and allow trade to resume with us, to drop the Berlin and Milan decrees, drop the orders in council, and admit that the United States, as a neutral, has a right, unrestricted trade with everybody. Now, Jefferson knew that this was going to hurt the American economy. I mean, we depend on trade. And he knew that cutting off trade would hurt. But his analysis was, what do we export to them? Well, we export agricultural products, aka food. What do we import from them? Well, we import manufactured goods. Well, these lead to a higher quality of life in the United States. One of the things that's characteristic of our very high standard of living is that we do have a wide range of luxury and other items available for import. And so we live very well, and it's very nice to have all those imports, but they aren't quite as essential to life as food. So the argument is, these measures may hurt us, but they will hurt England and France more. If we cut off our basic food to them, if they're faced with hunger and starvation in their civilian populations because of the drop of what for them are imports of American food, of American grain and other American edibles, that they're going to have to yield. So that's why it was done. As I said, it was a very strict measure. It prohibited all trade, even trade with ourselves. We have a lot of trade between ports. The only way to get from one port of the country to another is by sea. So there's a lot of trade from one American port to another, just regular interstate commerce. And a lot of it's carried by sea, and that's cut off. We don't want American ships out there where they could be confiscated by either the British or the French Navy. So, total shutdown of the American economy. And as I said, Jefferson knew this was going to hurt, but he thought it would hurt them more than it would hurt us. The Embargo Act was extremely unpopular. There's a lot of political opposition to it. I told you last time that the Federalist Party has sort of been dropping ever since they lost the election of 1800. Politically, the party was really losing strength, but it kind of rebounded with the unpopularity of the Embargo Act. The Federalists sort of adopted opposition to the act as part of their program, and they got some political support because of the unpopularity of the Embargo Act. So it was politically very unpopular, and it really did hurt the American economy. It was devastating. So in fact, after a few months, just before Jefferson left office in 1809, he was elected in 1800, re-elected in 1804. In 1808, he's going to be followed by James Madison. Just before Madison came into office, Congress repealed the Embargo Act. We were wrong. It had hurt us more than it hurt England and France. And so we had to admit this. We had to back down and repeal the Embargo Act. But now Madison, as president, is faced with the problem. Okay, so trade is resumed, and people are happy. I mean, there's a chance for the economy to recover. But we've got the problem. What do we do about the Berlin and Milan decrees? What do we do about the Orders in Council? What do we do about the fact that we still need to have England and France admit that we're neutral, and yeah, we're out there trading, but they're both seizing American ships. The French Navy is confiscating ships that they say are sailing to England, and the English Navy is confiscating ships that they say are sailing to France. So they're both violating our rights again. And what are we going to do about that? You know, we don't have the Embargo Act, so what are we going to do? Well, as sort of a substitute, Congress passed another law that was less severe than the original Embargo Act. You might call it sort of embargo light. A less severe act that did not apply to other neutrals and did not apply to inter-American trade. So this was still allowing some trade. It's just going to stop trade that we have with England and France themselves. So we hope this would be, by being less severe economically, wouldn't hurt the economy as bad, and we could get away with it. And that was wrong. It still caused a great deal of damage to the economy. It still hurt our whole trade. It was hurting us. It may or may not have been hurting England and France, but it was hurting us. Politically, it was extremely unpopular. The Federalists, which had looked like they were headed for oblivion, have sort of come back because of the unpopularity of the act, which they've adopted. And so, again, that act was repealed. So then we're now going to try again. So in 1811 now, we're getting up to time's going by here, we adopted what was called Macon's Bill Number 2, and that's kind of a weird name. I'll have to write it down for you, but because it doesn't make any sense just by itself. Macon's Bill Number 2. And this is going to try to cut off our trade, but we're going to do it in a little bit more sort of rational way. Instead of saying, well, we're not going to trade with you unless you repeal your measures, we're going to kind of go about it a slightly different way. We'll resume our trade with England and France, which of course we need. We need that trade very badly. That's very important to our economy. We'll resume trade with England and its allies, France and its allies, and everybody else. But if one of them says that they will repeal their measures that we don't like, then we will reimpose an embargo against the other side. It's a little bit complicated, and I hope you can figure it out. If not, send me an email. I would love to hear from you. But the idea is, it's sort of like instead of using a stick, we're going to use a carrot. We're going to say to England, look, if you want us to stop trading with France, we'll do it if you will repeal the Orders in Council. And then we sort of say the same thing to France, if you'll repeal the Berlin and Milan decrees, then we will reimpose an embargo against England. So we're still trying to get them to repeal their measures. We're just trying to do it in a little bit more subtle way.